The Empire had conquered 47 worlds across 3 galaxies. They had never lost a war. They had never retreated from a battle. Their armies numbered in the billions, and their ships darkened the skies of every planet they chose to claim. When their scouts discovered Earth, they saw a small blue world filled with creatures who had only recently learned to travel between stars. The High Council approved the invasion without debate. It would be simple. It would be quick. Another world would fall under rule before the next lunar cycle. Admiral was given command of the invasion fleet. He was old by standards, with gray scales covering his long face and scars from a dozen campaigns marking his body. He had led the conquest of where he had burned cities that were older than human civilization. He had crushed the rebellion on Prime, where he had executed 10,000 prisoners to make a point. He did not expect Earth to be a challenge. His intelligence officers told him the humans were divided into competing nations. They fought among themselves constantly. They would crumble at the first show of force. The fleet assembled near the edge of their territory. 9,900 warships, each one carrying soldiers, weapons, and supplies for a long occupation. The smallest ships were fast attack corvettes with crews of 50. The largest were dreadnoughts that stretched 3 kilometers from bow to stern, carrying enough firepower to crack a moon in half. Admiral stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and watched his fleet prepare for the jump to hyperspace. He felt nothing but confidence. On Earth, it was a quiet Tuesday morning in September of the year 2347. Commander Ben sat in the control room of Sentinel-7, an orbital defense platform floating high above the Pacific Ocean. He was 43 years old, a career military officer who had spent most of his adult life staring at sensor screens and hoping he would never see anything unusual. He was drinking his 3rd cup of coffee when the proximity alarm started screaming. Ben spilled the coffee across his uniform as he jumped from his chair. The sensor display was filled with red dots, so many that they blurred together into a solid mass of color. He counted the contacts once, then twice, then a 3rd time because he could not believe what he was seeing. Nearly 10,000 ships had just appeared at the edge of the solar system. They were moving toward Earth at incredible speed. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady when he opened the communication channel to Earth Command. He had trained for this moment. Every officer in the United Earth Defense Force had trained for this moment. They had run simulations and drills and exercises for 300 years, ever since scientists first detected radio signals from distant stars and realized that humanity was not alone in the universe. But training was different from reality. Simulations did not make your heart pound in your chest. General Kate received the transmission in the underground command bunker beneath the mountains of Colorado. She was 51 years old, with short gray hair and a face that rarely showed emotion. She had risen through the ranks by being calm when others panicked and decisive when others hesitated. She looked at the sensor data for exactly 4 seconds before she made her decision. She typed a single code into her terminal and pressed send. The message traveled at the speed of light to every military installation on Earth, to every colony on Mars and the moons of Jupiter, to every ship and station and outpost that flew the flag of United Earth. Protocol Omega. It meant that an alien invasion was. It meant that every soldier, every pilot, every officer was now at war. The fleet arrived in orbit around Earth 3 hours later. Admiral ordered his communication officers to broadcast a message on all frequencies. The message was simple: surrender immediately. Submit to enslavement. Your world now belongs to the Empire. Resistance will result in the complete extinction of your species. You have 1 hour to respond. The humans did not respond for 58 minutes. Admiral assumed they were debating among themselves, arguing and fighting as his intelligence reports said they always did. He pictured their leaders screaming at each other while their people ran through the streets in terror. He had seen it before on other worlds. Fear made species weak. Fear made them easy to control. In the bunker beneath Colorado, General Kate was not afraid. She was coordinating the largest military mobilization in human history. Ships that had been hidden in secret bases beneath the surface of Mars were launching into space. Pilots were climbing into fighters on orbital carriers that had been built for this exact scenario. Soldiers were taking positions in cities and mountains and bunkers across every continent. The defense grid was coming online, weapons systems that the rest of the galaxy did not know existed. Kate had spent her entire career preparing for a moment she never truly believed would come, but here it was, and she was ready. When the hour was nearly over, she recorded a response to the demands. She did not consult with politicians or diplomats. She did not ask for permission from the civilian government. Protocol Omega gave her complete authority over military operations. The survival of the human species was now her responsibility. The message she sent was short. 2 words transmitted across every frequency, broadcast to every ship in orbit and recorded for history. "Come get us." Admiral heard the response and laughed. He turned to his officers and told them the humans were either very brave or very stupid, probably both. He ordered the fleet to begin the attack. The first wave of fighters launched from the carrier ships, screaming down through the atmosphere toward the planet below. They expected easy targets. They expected primitive defenses. They expected a species that would break and run at the first sign of real combat. They were wrong. The orbital defense platforms opened fire at the same moment. Beams of concentrated energy cut through fighters like a blade through paper. Missiles launched from hidden silos on the surface, racing up through the atmosphere to meet the incoming ships. The first destroyer exploded in a ball of orange fire, then a second, then a third. Admiral watched his sensor display in silence. The smile was gone from his face. Something was wrong. These humans were not supposed to have this kind of firepower. His intelligence officers had made a terrible mistake. The battle for Earth had begun, and they were about to learn what happened when they attacked a species that had spent 3 centuries preparing for war. Lieutenant Danny Cole had been flying fighters since he was 19 years old. He was 32 now, a veteran of the border skirmishes near the outer colonies, and one of the best pilots in the Earth Defense Force. His squadron was called the Hell Hawks, and they flew the interceptors in the fleet, small fast ships that could outrun almost anything in space. When the invasion alarm sounded, Danny was playing cards with his wingman in the ready room of the carrier Yorktown. 3 minutes later, he was in his cockpit, strapped into his seat and waiting for the launch order. The carrier shook as weapons struck its shields. Danny felt the vibration through his controls and tried not to think about how thin the metal was between him and the vacuum of space. He had trained for this. He had prepared for this. But nothing could truly prepare a person for the moment when death was falling from the sky like rain. The launch order came and Danny shot forward through the magnetic accelerator. Stars spun around him as he cleared the carrier and dove into the battle. The space around Earth was filled with ships, thousands of them, firing weapons and launching missiles and exploding into clouds of debris. It was chaos. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. Danny found his first target within seconds. A fighter was chasing one of his squadron mates, firing green energy bolts that left glowing trails in the darkness. Danny came up behind it and squeezed the trigger on his controls. His ship's guns roared and the fighter came apart in pieces. His squadron mate transmitted a quick thanks and banked away to find another target. The Hellhawks fought for 6 hours straight. They refueled twice by docking with automated supply drones that floated through the battlefield. They lost 4 pilots in the first engagement, good people that Danny had known for years, but they destroyed 11 enemy ships for everyone they lost. The math was working in humanity's favor. On the far side of Earth, Dr. Laura worked in her laboratory aboard the Lunar Research Station. She was 38 years old, a scientist who had spent her entire career studying alien technology. In 2298, a probe from another civilization had crashed in the mountains of northern Canada. The probe was damaged, but its computer systems were intact. Laura had been part of the team that spent decades learning its secrets. Now she was using that knowledge against them. Her team had discovered something important about the alien probe. Its communication systems used a universal protocol, a standard method of transmitting data that many spacefaring species seem to share. They used the same protocol. This meant that Laura could send messages directly into their network, messages that looked like they came from their own commanders, messages that carried hidden instructions buried in the code. Laura called it a virus. It was a simple program that told ships to identify friendly vessels as enemies. The effect was immediate and devastating. Admiral stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion and watched two of his cruisers open fire on each other. Explosions bloomed across their hulls as their weapons tore into metal and machinery. Officers were screaming on the communication channels, demanding to know why they were being attacked by their own fleet. The Admiral had no answer. He did not understand what was happening. By the time his technicians identified the virus and purged it from the network, 17 more ships had been destroyed by friendly fire. The humans had turned his own weapons against him without firing a single shot. The first day of the invasion ended with the losing 412 ships. They had destroyed only 23 human vessels. Admiral ordered a tactical withdrawal to the outer part of the solar system. His fleet needed time to regroup, time to understand what they were facing, time to develop new strategies. It was the first time in history that an invasion fleet had retreated from a first contact engagement. The news spread quickly through the empire. Doubt began to creep into the minds of soldiers who had never known defeat. On Earth, the news spread just as quickly. Cities that had been preparing for the worst began to celebrate. People danced in the streets and hugged strangers and cried with relief. But General Kate did not celebrate. She knew the battle was far from over. The Still had thousands of ships. They would adapt. They would learn from their mistakes, and they would come back. Kate gathered her commanders in the bunker beneath Colorado. She stood before a holographic map of the solar system that showed the positions of every ship, both human and alien. The fleet was regrouping near Europa, one of the moons of Jupiter. They were licking their wounds and planning their next move. Kate planned to hit them before they were ready. She assigned Commander Sam Price to lead the counterattack. Sam was 50 years old, a quiet man with sad eyes who had lost his wife to cancer 3 years before the invasion. He had thrown himself into his work after her death, spending long hours developing tactics and training crews for the submarine-class stealth ships that were humanity's most secret weapons. These ships were designed to be invisible to sensors, to slip through enemy formations without being detected, to strike from the shadows and disappear before anyone could respond. Sam took his flagship, the Neptune's Shadow, and 4 sister vessels deep into enemy territory. They moved slowly, carefully, using the radiation from Jupiter's magnetic field to mask their approach. They never saw them coming. The first attack came at midnight Earth time. Sam's ships launched torpedoes at a fuel depot, destroying enough fuel to power 100 ships for a year. Before the enemy could respond, the stealth vessels were gone, vanishing into the darkness of space like ghosts. The second attack came 6 hours later. A command ship exploded when a bomb detonated in its engine room. No one knew how the bomb had gotten there. Security footage showed nothing unusual, but the ship was dead, along with 400 crew members and 3 senior officers. Admiral raged at his subordinates. How were the humans doing this? How were they getting past his defenses? His soldiers began to look over their shoulders constantly, jumping at shadows, afraid to sleep because death might come for them at any moment. They had never encountered guerrilla warfare. They did not understand how to fight an enemy that refused to face them in open battle. Their entire military doctrine was built on overwhelming force and direct engagement. Hit the enemy with everything you have. Crush them beneath your boot. Move on to the next world. But the humans did not fight that way. They hid. They tricked. They struck from angles that should have been impossible and then melted away before anyone could strike back. It was a way of war that they had no answer for. And it was only the beginning. The fleet remained near Europa for 2 weeks. Admiral sent urgent messages to the Empire, demanding reinforcements. The response was not what he hoped to hear. The nearest available fleet was 8 months away. He would have to win this war with the ships he had. The attacks from the human stealth vessels continued without pause. Commander Sam Price and his shadow fleet struck at random intervals, never following a pattern that they could predict. A supply convoy was ambushed near Callisto. A communications relay was destroyed near Ganymede. Officers began dying in their quarters, killed by microdrones that slipped through ventilation systems and delivered poison while they slept. The soldiers stopped sleeping. They posted guards at every door and scanned every room for hidden threats. But the humans always found a way through. It was as if they could walk through walls. Admiral gathered his senior officers for a strategy meeting. The faces around the table were tired and frightened. These were warriors who had conquered worlds, who had faced enemy armies without flinching, but they had never experienced anything like this. The humans were getting inside their heads. Fear was spreading through the fleet like a disease. One of the officers suggested that they retreat entirely, leave this system and return with a larger force. Admiral rejected the idea immediately. The Empire did not retreat. The shame would be too great. He would rather die than go home a failure. Instead, he ordered a ground assault. If the humans wanted to fight in the shadows, he would take the battle to their home. He would land soldiers on Earth and crush them in direct combat, the way they had always fought. 10,000 troops loaded into drop ships and headed for the surface. They chose San Francisco as their landing zone, a major city on the western coast of the American continent. The dropships screamed down through the atmosphere, their heat shields glowing orange against the friction of the air. Human fighters rose to meet them and destroyed many before they could land, but hundreds made it through. The soldiers poured out of their ships and into the streets of the city, ready to fight. What they found was a trap. Sergeant Nick Palmer had been waiting for them. He was 29 years old, born and raised in San Francisco, and he knew every street and alley and building in the city. His platoon had spent 3 days preparing for this moment, planting explosives in strategic locations, setting up ambush points in abandoned buildings, mapping escape routes through the sewers beneath the streets. The soldiers were bigger than humans. They stood over 2 meters tall with thick scales that could stop small-caliber bullets. They carried plasma rifles that could burn through concrete walls. In open combat on an empty field, they would have torn the human soldiers apart. But this was not open combat. This was urban warfare. The first squad walked into a narrow alley between 2 tall buildings. They were scanning for targets, their weapons raised, moving carefully but confidently. They did not see Nick Palmer on the roof above them until it was too late. He pressed a button on his detonator, and the walls of both buildings collapsed inward, burying the entire squad under tons of rubble. All across the city, similar scenes played out. Soldiers turned corners and found themselves facing walls of gunfire from defenders who knew exactly where to position themselves. Buildings exploded when enemy troops entered them. Bridges collapsed under the weight of armored vehicles. The streets became a maze of death. The commander on the ground was a young officer named Al. He had never lost a battle before. By the end of the first hour, he had lost a third of his soldiers. He ordered his troops to regroup in a large open plaza where they would have clear lines of sight, where the humans could not ambush them from hidden positions. The plaza was surrounded by tall buildings on every side. Al realized his mistake too late. Snipers opened fire from dozens of windows, picking off his soldiers one by one. When his troops tried to return fire, the snipers simply moved to new positions. They had no idea where the shots were coming from. Major Amy Grant coordinated the defense from a bunker beneath City Hall. She was 41 years old, a career soldier who had written 3 books on urban combat tactics. She watched the battle through camera feeds and drone surveillance, moving her troops like pieces on a chess board, always staying one step ahead of the enemy. A captured officer was brought to her bunker for interrogation. He was wounded, his scales cracked and bleeding from shrapnel, but he still glared at her with hatred in his eyes. He spat at her feet and cursed her in his language. Amy Grant sat down across from him and lit a cigarette. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she asked him a simple question. How does it feel to lose? The officer's face twisted with rage. You fight without honor, he said. You hide in the shadows like cowards. You use tricks and traps instead of facing us like warriors. Amy Grant smiled at him. She took a long drag from her cigarette and blew the smoke toward the ceiling. We call it winning, she said. Within 3 weeks, every soldier on Earth's surface was dead or captured. Not a single one made it back to their ships. The invasion fleet had lost another 2,100 vessels to human counterattacks in space. Admiral now commanded fewer than 7,400 ships. The humans were not content to simply defend their home. They were pushing outward, taking the fight to the enemy, hitting them harder with each passing day. The stealth ships continued their campaign of terror. The orbital defense platforms fired volleys of missiles at any vessel that came within range. The carriers launched wave after wave of fighters that swarmed over enemy formations like angry insects. Admiral began to understand something that none of his intelligence reports had warned him about. The humans were not a divided species constantly fighting among themselves. They were a species that channeled their aggression outward when threatened. They stopped fighting each other and united against the common enemy with a ferocity that the galaxy had never seen. He also understood something else, something that made his blood run cold. The humans were enjoying this. They were not fighting out of desperation or fear. They were fighting because they wanted to, because something deep in their nature craved conflict, craved victory, craved the chance to prove themselves against a stronger opponent. That had awakened something ancient and terrible in the human spirit. And now they had to deal with the consequences. Admiral made his decision on the 42nd day of the invasion. He would make his final stand near Saturn, using the planet's rings as cover for his remaining ships. He had lost too many vessels to continue offensive operations. His only hope now was to hold position, defend against human attacks, and wait for reinforcements that were still months away. His fleet of 7,371 ships formed a defensive sphere among the ice and rock of Saturn's rings. The debris provided natural cover against incoming fire. The formation allowed his vessels to support each other against attacks from any direction. It was a solid defensive position, one that would cost the humans dearly if they chose to assault it. General Kate studied the enemy formation from her command bunker on Earth. She had not slept more than 3 hours a night since the invasion began. Her eyes were red and her hands sometimes trembled from exhaustion, but her mind remained sharp. She saw the formation for what it was, a desperate move by a beaten enemy. It was time to end this war. She called a meeting with her senior commanders and revealed a weapon that had been kept secret for over a century. Project Longbow was born from the same research that had produced the stealth ships and the cyber warfare programs. It consisted of massive platforms hidden in the asteroid belt, capable of accelerating metal projectiles to nearly the speed of light. At those velocities, the projectiles carried more destructive power than nuclear weapons. They could punch through any shield, any armor, any defense that they possessed. The platforms had been built slowly over 80 years, constructed by automated factories that operated in complete secrecy. Not even most of the military knew they existed. Kate was one of fewer than a dozen people on Earth who had access to the firing codes. She gave the order to fire. Captain Chris Taylor stood on the bridge of the Carrier Valley Forge, watching the sensor displays with wide eyes. He was 35 years old, a man who had seen combat many times, but nothing had prepared him for what he was witnessing. The longbow projectiles crossed the distance between the asteroid belt and Saturn in less than 20 minutes. They struck the formation without warning. The first volley killed 900 ships in under 3 seconds. The projectiles moved too fast to be seen, too fast to be tracked, too fast to be stopped. One moment a dreadnought was floating among the rings, its shields at full power, its weapons ready for battle. The next moment it was atoms scattered across space. There was no explosion, no debris field, just nothing where a 3-kilometer warship had been a heartbeat before. Admiral screamed orders at his crew as chaos erupted around him. His formation was collapsing. Ships were dying faster than his sensors could track. The humans had found a way to kill them from across the solar system, striking from a distance so great that his fleet could not possibly fight back. But they were not cowards. They had conquered 47 worlds. They had faced death countless times. Even now, with their fleet being torn apart around them, they did not surrender. Admiral ordered his remaining ships to charge toward Earth, to close the distance and engage the human fleet in direct combat where the longbow weapons could not be used without hitting friendly vessels. The battle that followed lasted 6 days. It was the largest naval engagement in the history of either species. Thousands of ships clashed in the space between Saturn and Jupiter, filling the void with weapons fire and explosions and death. The human fleet took terrible losses. The carrier Lexington was destroyed when 3 cruisers focused their fire on it, burning through its shields and tearing its hull apart. Over 4,000 crew members died in less than a minute. The defense platform Sentinel-3 was rammed by a dreadnought in a suicide attack. The enemy captain had known his ship was dying, its engines failing and its weapons destroyed, so he used the last of his power to steer into the largest target he could find. The collision killed everyone on both vessels. Lieutenant Commander Bate Torres was piloting a bomber during the 3rd day of the battle when she received word that her husband had been aboard Sentinel-3. His name was. They had been married for 7 years. They had talked about having children after the war was over. Bate did not cry when she heard the news. She did not scream or break down or ask to be relieved of duty. She simply adjusted her targeting computer and continued flying her mission. Her squadron was assigned to attack the flagship, the Eternal Dominion, where Admiral commanded his fleet. The flagship was surrounded by a wall of defending ships. Every approach was covered by weapons fire. Dozens of human bombers had already been destroyed trying to breach the defenses. Bate knew she would probably die in the attempt. She did not care anymore. She pushed her engines to maximum power and dove straight toward the enemy flagship. Weapons fire streaked past her cockpit, so close that she could see the glow through her windows. Her squadron mates fell one by one, their ships exploding into balls of fire that faded quickly in the vacuum. But Bate kept flying. She transmitted a final message as she approached the flagship's reactor core. For Earth, she said, for everyone. Her bomber struck the Eternal Dominion at full speed, punching through its weakened shields and penetrating deep into the ship before detonating. The explosion tore through the flagship's power systems, creating a chain reaction that spread through the entire vessel. Secondary explosions bloomed across its hull like flowers of fire. Admiral was on the bridge when the lights went out. He felt the deck shake beneath his feet and knew that his ship was dying. He had a moment to consider the irony of his situation, conquered by a species he had dismissed as primitives, before the bulkhead collapsed and crushed him beneath tons of metal. The death of the flagship broke the formation. Ships that had been fighting with discipline and coordination began to scatter. Some tried to flee. Others continued fighting with desperate fury, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Captain Chris Taylor ordered the Valley Forge into the heart of the enemy fleet, launching fighters and firing every weapon his ship possessed. Around him, the human fleet pressed forward, pouring through the gap that Bate Torres had created. The line collapsed completely. By the end of the 6th day, the battle was over. The space around Saturn was filled with debris, the remains of thousands of ships from both sides. But the human fleet still flew. The fleet was shattered. General Kate received the final casualty reports in her bunker. Over 60,000 human soldiers and crew members had died in the six-day battle. It was the highest loss of life in any military engagement in human history. But they had won. The invasion fleet that had threatened to enslave their world was broken beyond repair. She allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment. Just a moment of rest before the work began again. There was still much to do. The fleet that had arrived with 9,900 warships was reduced to fewer than 50 functional vessels. Most of these were badly damaged, limping through space with failing engines and skeleton crews. The survivors gathered at the edge of the solar system, too beaten to fight but too afraid to run. A new commander took charge of the remnants. His name was a young captain who had never expected to lead anything larger than a single cruiser. Every officer senior to him was dead. He looked at the shattered remains of his fleet and made the only decision that made sense. He ordered a retreat. The surviving ships began their journey back to space. They moved slowly, their damaged engines unable to maintain full speed. Along the way, more ships failed. Reactors overloaded. Life support systems collapsed. Crews died from wounds that could not be treated with the limited medical supplies remaining. By the time the fleet reached the hyperspace jump point, only 17 ships remained operational. 17 vessels out of 9,900. It was the greatest military defeat in the history of the Empire. But the humans were not finished with them. Sergeant Nick Palmer had earned a reputation during the ground battle in San Francisco. The prisoners spoke of him with fear in their voices, describing a human who seemed to appear from nowhere, who killed without hesitation, who could not be stopped by any force they sent against him. When General Kate needed someone to lead the final assault on the retreating enemy fleet, she chose him. Nick led a team of Marines aboard a stealth transport that followed the survivors. They waited until the enemy ships were preparing for the hyperspace jump, then struck. The Marines boarded the largest remaining vessel, a cruiser called the Void Fang, and fought their way through its corridors. The soldiers aboard the ship were exhausted and demoralized. They had watched their fleet die around them. They had lost friends and comrades and leaders. When the human Marines appeared in their midst, many simply dropped their weapons and surrendered. Others fought, but their hearts were not in it. Nick Palmer reached the bridge of the Void Fang with 6 Marines at his back. The ship's captain stood waiting for him, old with silver scales and tired eyes. The captain held a plasma pistol in his hand but made no move to raise it. "This is the end," the captain said. "You have beaten us." Nick walked forward until he stood directly in front of the alien. He was covered in blood, some of it his own, most of it not. His armor was dented and scorched from close combat, but his eyes were calm. "Not the end," Nick said, "just the beginning." He took the plasma pistol from the captain's unresisting hand and turned to look out the bridge windows at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Empire was waiting. They would hear about this defeat. They would learn what happened when they attacked Earth. The 17 surviving ships jumped into hyperspace and fled toward home. They carried fewer than 3,000 survivors out of an invasion force that had numbered over 2 million. They brought with them recordings of the battle, censored data showing the destruction of their fleet, and testimonies from soldiers who had faced the humans in combat. The news reached the 3 months later. The High Council gathered to review the reports. They watched the footage of their ships being destroyed by the longbow weapons. They listened to the accounts of urban warfare in San Francisco, of guerrilla attacks that came from nowhere, of cyber weapons that turned their own vessels against each other. The Emperor sat in silence for a long time after the presentation ended. He was ancient by standards, over 300 years old, and he had ruled the Empire for most of that time. He had overseen the conquest of 47 worlds. He had never imagined that a species could defeat his fleets so completely. "Remove Earth from our expansion plans," he said finally. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Permanently." 6 months after the invasion ended, General Kate stood before the United Nations in New York. The chamber was filled with representatives from every nation on Earth, along with delegates from the Mars colonies and the stations around Jupiter. Billions more watched the broadcast across the planet and beyond. Kate was not a politician. She did not enjoy public speaking, but she understood the importance of this moment. The galaxy was watching. Other species, some friendly and some hostile, were paying attention to what humanity said and did now. She stepped up to the podium and began to speak. "We did not ask for this war. We did not seek it. We were a peaceful species, focused on building our civilization and exploring the stars. When they arrived in our skis, we offered them no threat. We had done nothing to earn their aggression. But when war came to our door, we answered. We fought with everything we had. We used every tool, every weapon, every strategy we could devise. We refused to surrender. We refused to submit. We refused to accept that our fate was to be slaves of an alien empire. Let this be a message to every species in the galaxy. Earth is not yours to take. Humanity will not kneel. And if you come for us, we will send you home in pieces." The chamber erupted in applause. Kate stood at the podium with her hands folded in front of her, her face expressionless. She had lost friends in this war. She had sent young men and women to die. The victory did not feel like something to celebrate, but it felt like something to be proud of. On a distant world at the far edge of space, a young scientist named studied the reports from the failed invasion. She was not. Her species had been conquered 2 centuries ago, reduced to servants and laborers for the empire. She had grown up believing that resistance was impossible, that they were too powerful to oppose. Now she knew better. She began to send messages to others like her, members of conquered species who dreamed of freedom. She told them about the humans. She told them about Earth. She told them that they could be beaten. The first sparks of rebellion began to ignite across the empire. On Earth, in a small bar in Houston, retired Commander Ben raised a glass to the stars. Around him sat the survivors of Sentinel-7, the platform that had first spotted the invasion fleet. There were only 12 of them left. The others had died in the weeks of fighting that followed. They drank in silence, remembering the friends they had lost and the victory they had won. Outside the bar, the night sky was clear and filled with stars. Somewhere out there, other species were watching humanity with new eyes, some with fear, some with hope, and all of them with a new understanding of what this small blue world was capable of when pushed to the edge. The invasion had begun with 9,900 ships. Only 17 ever made it back. And the galaxy would never forget.